They said it couldn't last. Every empire that rose beside it eventually crumbled. Every conqueror who tried to break it either failed or was swallowed whole by it. Greece came, Rome came, Persia came. And yet, for 3,000 years, ancient Egypt didn't just survive. It dominated, it dazzled, it buried its enemies and then built monuments tall enough to be seen from the next world. But here's what nobody tells you. Egypt almost didn't make it, not once, not twice. Multiple times across its history, civilization came within a breath of total collapse. Famine wiped out entire generations, foreign armies occupied the Nile Delta, and civil wars split the nation in two. Pharaohs were assassinated by their own wives, their own guards, and their own sons. And every single time Egypt clawed its way back. This is the story of how that happened. This is the rise and fall of ancient Egypt. 3,000 years of power, war, and mystery. And it begins not with a king, not with a pyramid, not with gold, but with a river that decided to behave in a way no river had any right to behave. The Sahara Desert is one of the most unforgiving places on earth. Almost nothing lives there and almost nothing grows there. The sun doesn't warm land, it punishes it. And yet cutting straight through the heart of all that emptiness is the Nile River. Along its narrow banks, the land is so fertile, so impossibly green, that ancient writers described it as a gift from the gods. They weren't wrong, because every year, without fail, the Nile flooded. It rose, it spread across the surrounding earth, and left behind a thick, dark layer of nutrient-rich silt. When it receded, farmers planted, and what they grew fed millions. This cycle of planting, flooding, and harvesting repeated, and that is what made everything possible. Not military genius, not divine favor, not luck, but an unpredictable river. By 5000 BC, communities were already settling along the riverbanks, figuring out irrigation, domesticating animals, and burying their dead with increasing care and ceremony. They were hopeful of building something along the banks, but they just didn't know yet how large it would become. Along the line, two separate kingdoms were formed, namely Upper Egypt, which is in the dry south, and Lower Egypt, which is in the marshy north near the Mediterranean. These two separate kingdoms resulted in different cultures, different gods, and different crowns. For centuries they existed side by side, trading and sometimes fighting. Around 3100 BC, a warrior king from the south named Nama marched north. He conquered Lower Egypt and put on both kingdom crowns at once, and just like that, a new nation was born. But a nation on paper and a nation in practice are two very different things. The early dynasties were brutal, uncertain, and brilliant. Kings rose and were quickly replaced. Tombs grew larger with each generation that passed by, as if every pharaoh were in a competition with death itself. Writing appeared not just as symbols, but as a full hieroglyphic language capable of recording laws, stories, prayers, administrative records, etc. A bureaucracy also emerged, as well as tax systems, census counts, and trade routes stretching from south to Nubia to east and into Canaan. Egypt was not just surviving, it was organizing. There came the moment that changed its architecture forever. Pharaoh Djoser had a vizier named Imhotep. The man was extraordinary. He was an architect, a physician, an astronomer, and a scholar. When Djoser asked Imhotep to build a royal tomb, Imhotep looked at every flat-topped mastaba that had come before, every rectangular mud-brick grave that kings had been buried in for generations, and he thought about something unique and different, and then asked, what if you stacked them? What if each layer was slightly smaller than the one beneath, rising up until the whole structure pointed at the sky? He then decided to build it in stone, not mud brick, not clay, but complete stone, which was 6 steps and 62 meters tall. He built the step pyramid of Saqqara, which became the tallest building on earth at the time it was completed, and the blueprint for everything that came after. What Imhotep started, the 4th dynasty continued and perfected it. Pharaoh Sneferu alone built 3 pyramids afterwards. He learned from each one's flaws. He corrected angles and refined techniques. He built the bent pyramid, which still stands. While building, the slope of the pyramid visibly shifted midway up, and the workers realized that the angle was too steep, so they ended up changing course rather than stopping. Sneferu vowed not to abandon the vision, so he decided to start another one, which he named the Red Pyramid. The Red Pyramid became Egypt's first geometrically perfect pyramid, built from reddish limestone on a solid foundation, rising at a steady angle to 105 meters. His son Khufu then looked at everything that his father had built and decided none of it was enough. Then came the Great Pyramid of Giza, a pyramid built from 2.3 million stone blocks in which the heaviest weighs over 80 tons. It aligned to the cardinal points of the compass with an accuracy that makes modern engineers genuinely uncomfortable. The interior was so precisely constructed that a sheet of paper cannot even fit in between many of the stones. It was built over 20 years by a workforce that archaeology now estimates was around 20,000 to 30,000 people. These people were not slaves, they were workers who were paid, fed, and given medical care. Their records survived in the papyrus documents discovered as recently as 2013. These were people who knew exactly what they were building, and they knew it would outlast everything. They were definitely right, because the Great Pyramid stood as the tallest structure on Earth for 300 to 800 years, and nothing surpassed it until the construction of the Lincoln Cathedral in England in 1311 AD. Can you believe that? Think about it. The Great Pyramid stood for nearly 4,000 years as the tallest thing humans had ever built, and it still stands up until today. But here is the tension that was building beneath all this grandeur. This is the part where the monuments definitely don't show you. To build on this scale required money, enormous, sustained, almost incomprehensible amounts of money. This money required a centralized government with total control. The pharaohs had this control for a while, but control, like stones, will definitely develop cracks when under pressure. The cracks became chasms by the 6th dynasty. This made the local governors and the nomarchs start accumulating power for generations, each one carving out a little more authority, a little more land, and a little more independence from the crown. The priests did the same, and that caused a turned climate, which resulted in several consecutive years of low Nile floods, ending up in poor harvests. Poor harvest meant famine, and famine obviously meant chaos. This collapsed the old kingdom because there was no one strong enough to hold Egypt together when Pepi Seku, who had ruled Egypt for nearly 90 years, outliving most of his heirs, finally died. What followed was the first intermediate period, a dark chapter that Egyptian texts described with barely concealed horror. No single pharaoh controlled the whole country. Warlords ruled their own regions, and this brought a stop to great construction projects. Art became regional and inconsistent. The elaborated social structures that had fed and organized millions also broke down in several places. This made ancient writers from this period describe children who were abandoned by their parents as the well-fed going hungry and the respected going unrespected. This was, by any measure, a huge catastrophe. Yet again, Egypt came right back like it always does. A series of Theban kings from the south slowly and painfully reunited the nation. Mentuhotep II defeated the northern rulers, consolidated power, and dragged Egypt out of its dark age. This act gave birth to the Middle Kingdom, and with it a new sophistication. Pharaohs of the 12th dynasty then reformed the administration. They opened trade routes and built irrigation systems that were so advanced that desert regions ended up blooming into farmland. Senusret III pushed Egypt's borders deep into Nubia with military campaigns that were relentless and precise. By this, literature flourished and philosophy developed. With this philosophy, Egyptians began writing stories not just for the gods and the kings, but for ordinary people. This was in many ways Egypt's most human era. However, power always invites enemies, which led to Egypt's second great collapse. This collapse didn't come from within, but from the eastern Hyksos. The name Hyksos still carries a faint chill in historical texts to date. Nobody knows exactly where they came from. The Egyptians called them rulers of foreign lands and described them as Asian, a term given to anyone who comes from the eastern part of the border. They didn't invade in a single dramatic assault. They moved in gradually through trade, through immigration, through the slow, patient accumulation of wealth and influence in the eastern Nile Delta. By the time the weakened 13th dynasty realized what was happening, the Hyksos were already in control of Lower Egypt. Suddenly, the most powerful military civilization in the ancient world found itself technologically outmatched in its own homeland. For generations, the upper eastern part of Egypt paid tribute to the Hyksos in the north, while watching Nubian power grow in the south. This made Egypt be squeezed from both sides. The Theban king Seqenenre-Tau finally snapped, went to war, and died on the battlefield. His son, Kamose, tried to push further by attacking Hyksos strongholds with ferocious energy. But it was Ahmose I who finished what his father and brother had started. He drove the Hyksos out of Egypt, chased them into Canaan, and besieged their last city for 6 years. After that, he then turned south and broke the Nubian kingdom's power too. Egypt wasn't just freed, it was furious. And a furious Egypt with new military technology and a score to settle is one of the most dangerous things the ancient world had ever produced. The new kingdom that followed was Egypt at its absolute peak. Thutmose I hung the body of a defeated Nubian king from the prow of his ship as a warning. Thutmose III, who was arguably the greatest military mind Egypt ever produced, launched 17 campaigns in 20 years that expanded Egypt's territory from Libya to Syria and from the Mediterranean to deep sub-Saharan Africa. This is why Thutmose III was sometimes called the Napoleon of ancient Egypt. There came Hatshepsut, who was the wife of Thutmose and also was the woman who ruled as a man and built an empire of stone. She declared herself pharaoh when her husband died and wore the double crown. During the coronation ceremony, she donned a false beard and commissioned statues showing her in full royal regalia. She governed brilliantly by sending trade expeditions to the land of Punt and returned with exotic animals, incense trees, gold, and ivory. She also expanded the temple complex at Karnak and built her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, a structure that was so elegant, so harmoniously designed into the natural cliffs behind it, that modern architects still study it for inspiration. When she died, someone tried to erase her by smashing her statues. Her name was chiseled off temple walls. Her image was replaced with blank stone. The working theory was that Thutmose III was finally free to rule alone after decades in Hatshepsut's shadow, so they wanted her legacy destroyed. But you cannot chisel a woman like Hatshepsut out of history because she had survived too much, and today she stands as one of Egypt's most celebrated rulers. She is more powerful in death than most pharaohs ever were in life. The new kingdom continued its glorious, complicated, occasionally self-destructive march through the centuries. Amenhotep III ruled Egypt, which was so wealthy and so artistically magnificent that foreign kings wrote him letters begging for gold, describing Egypt as a place where gold was as plentiful as dust. But sadly, his son Amenhotep IV took that wealth, that stability, that carefully maintained religious order and blew it up. He then changed his name to Akhenaten and dissolved the entire Egyptian pantheon of thousands of years of gods, temples, priests, and rituals, and declared that there was only one god called Aten, who is the sun disk. He then built a brand new capital city in the desert and moved the entire royal court there and shut down every temple in Egypt. The priests of Amun, who had accumulated extraordinary wealth and power over centuries, were stripped of everything overnight. It was the most radical religious revolution in the ancient world, and it lasted barely 20 years. When Akhenaten died, his 9-year-old son took the throne. The boy was called Tutankhaten, meaning named for the new god. Within 2 years, he changed his name to Tutankhamun, reopened the temples, restored the old gods, and moved the capital back to Thebes. He was trying to hold Egypt together, but sadly he died at the age of 18. It is not known exactly how he died, but his tomb was sealed and forgotten for over 3,000 years. After 3,000 years, his tomb was opened by Howard Carter in 1922, and it revealed treasures so overwhelming that Carter sat in silence for several minutes before he could speak. And then came Ramses the Great, and immediately Egypt roared back to its full, terrifying glory. He ruled for 67 years, and he built temples, colossi, obelisks, and whole cities bearing his name on a scale that hadn't been seen since the Old Kingdom. He fought the Hittite Empire at the Battle of Kadesh in a confrontation that was so dramatic in 1274 BC. Ramses rode to Kadesh at the head of 20,000 soldiers who were divided into 4 divisions. Near the city, 2 captured Bedouin informants told him the Hittite army was far away, and there was nothing to worry about. He also believed them, not knowing they were Hittite spies. At that time, the Hittite king Muwatalli II had already positioned 3,500 war chariots and 37,000 soldiers on the other side of the bridge. So when they attacked, Ramses was surrounded, outnumbered, and facing imminent destruction. What happened next has been told and retold for 3,000 years. Ramses personally led charge after charge into the Hittite lines. He rallied his panicking troops, and he fought his way out of encirclement through sheer and almost suicidal aggression. His remaining division arrived in time and pushed the Hittites back to the river. The battle ended in a bloody, exhausted stalemate. Both sides were too tired to fight anymore, so they both claimed victory, and what came next had never happened before in human history. Ramses II and the Hittite king sat down and wrote a peace treaty, which became the earliest known international peace agreement, and copies in both Egyptian hieroglyphics and Hittite cuneiform were made. A replica of this treaty currently hangs on the wall of the United Nations headquarters in New York, and a man who lived 3,000 years before the modern age helped invent diplomacy. But even Ramses II could not live forever. He ruled for 67 years, long enough to watch most of his sons die before him. Egypt began to age around him. Even the priests of Amun, who rebuilt their power since Akhenaten's purge, grew rich and influential again. However, the treasury was thinning, and this multiplied foreign threats along the coasts and the mysterious sea peoples, raiders of unknown origin, who were simultaneously dismantling civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean. The Hittites, unfortunately, fell to them. Greece's Bronze Age also collapsed, and great cities got burnt. Egypt alone held it. Ramses III, who was the last great warrior pharaoh, met the sea peoples in a massive naval battle and crushed them. His archers lined the coast, hidden in the reeds, waiting for the signal. When the enemy ships entered the kill zone, the sky turned black with arrows. Ships caught fire, crews drowned, and the sea peoples who made it to shore were cut down or taken prisoner. Egypt survived once again, but at a devastating cost. The treasury was empty, and workers building the royal tombs at Deir el-Medina went unpaid for months. The workers walked off the job. They sat down and refused to move until they received what was owed to them. This led to the world's first recorded labor strike in 1170 BC. The government eventually paid up, but the message became clear: the old certainties were gone. Ramses III was murdered by conspiracy in his own household, organized by a minor wife who was hoping to put her son on the throne. The trial records survived in the judicial papyrus of Turin, listing the accused, the charges, and the punishments. The man who built an empire, who defeated the sea peoples, and who held Egypt together through its greatest external crisis, was killed by people who slept under his own roof. This led to a slow decline where pharaohs named Ramses IV, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11, each one weaker than the last, and each one fighting a losing battle against the priests of Amun, who had essentially become a shadow government. The empire shrank. Nubia broke free. The great building project slowed, then stopped. Foreign mercenaries filled the army, and the royal tombs were robbed not by outsiders, but by the very workers and officials meant to guard them. By 1070 BC, Egypt had split in two again. And this time the recovery was slower, messier, and incomplete. What came next was centuries of fragmentation, foreign domination, brief revivals, fresh collapses, and Libyan warlords taking the throne. Nubian kings from Kush swept north and ruled Egypt with genuine reverence for its culture, building pyramids of their own. The Assyrians also invaded from Mesopotamia and sacked Thebes, which was the sacred heart of Egypt, in 663 BC. The Persians conquered the country twice, ruling it with varying degrees of cruelty and admiration. Each time Egypt fell under foreign control, it absorbed its conquerors, changed them, converted them, and made them dress like pharaohs and make offerings to the Egyptian gods. And then came Alexander in 332 BC. He was the young Macedonian king who arrived at Egypt's border, not with a sword raised in conquest, but with an offer of liberation, because he had just dismantled the Persian Empire. Egypt, exhausted by Persian rule, welcomed him as a hero. He marched to the ancient oracle at Siwa in the western desert, and what the oracle told him there, he never fully revealed. But he came back calling himself the son of Amun, and he was crowned pharaoh. He founded a city on the Mediterranean coast and named it after himself. Alexandria would become the intellectual capital of the ancient world, home to the great library, the lighthouse, and the greatest concentration of scholarship civilization had yet produced. When Alexander died at 32, his general Ptolemy took Egypt and founded a dynasty that would last nearly 300 years. They ruled as pharaohs, they spoke the Egyptian language, and they built temples. They funded science and philosophy at a scale that shaped the entire Western world. One of them, which is the very last of them, was Cleopatra VII. She spoke 9 languages and was the first Ptolemaic ruler to actually learn Egyptian. She understood politics, economics, military strategy, and the art of alliance with a clarity that made her one of the most formidable rulers the ancient world had ever seen. She forged alliances with Caesar and then with Mark Antony, trying to use Roman power to preserve Egyptian independence. But she failed on her own terms by refusing to be paraded through Rome as a trophy and choosing death over humiliation. In 30 BC, Egypt became a Roman province. 3,000 years of continuous civilization, the longest-running political and cultural entity in human history to that point, folded into an empire. The temples slowly fell silent, the hieroglyphs stopped being written, and the last person who could read them died sometime around 400 AD. For 1,400 years, the greatest written record of the ancient world sat on walls and papyrus scrolls, completely unreadable, until that French soldier hit a stone near Alexandria in 1799, until the Rosetta Stone gave scholars the key, until Egypt began, slowly and then all at once, to speak again. And what it says across all those thousands of years, across the dynasties and the wars, the collapses and the revivals, is something almost unbearably human. We were here, we built things that mattered, and we loved our children, feared our gods, and made mistakes, and tried again. We raised walls against the darkness and filled them with images of everything we wanted to remember. Look at what we left behind. The Nile still flows, the pyramids still stand, the temples at Karnak still hold the names of kings carved 3,000 years ago by hands that trembled slightly in the desert heat, trying to get the letters right, trying to make something that would last. They did. 3,000 years of power, war, and mystery. And it is not over yet. Every year the sand gives something back. A sealed tomb, a forgotten text, a statue still standing underground in the dark, waiting patiently for someone to find it. The story of ancient Egypt is not finished. It is just resting. And if history has taught us anything, it always comes back.